In a time of universal deceit, telling the truth is a revolutionary act. Pause for a moment and ask yourself, when was the last time you were rewarded for depth? Not praised, not liked, but genuinely seen for your complexity, your contradictions, your quiet truth. In today's world, it is not the thoughtful who rise, but the performative. Not the wise, but the well-branded. We live in a time where the loudest voice drowns out the truest one. Where attention is currency and authenticity a liability, we reward the shallow, not by mistake, but by design. Look around. Influencers with nothing to say command millions. Public discourse is reduced to sound bites. Identity is flattened into slogans. Even pain must be palatable to be marketable. George Orwell foresaw this, a world where truth is distorted, not just by the state, but by the culture itself. Where the individual, in their search for meaning, is slowly trained to betray themselves. But this isn't just about algorithms or capitalism, This is something deeper, a spiritual crisis, a psychological decay. Carl Jung once warned that people will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own souls. Not the curated mask they wear at work or on social media. And perhaps that's the true danger of the shallow. Not that it's superficial, but that it seduces us away from depth. Carl Jung called this the shadow, the parts of ourselves we repress, deny, or avoid. Instead of facing ourselves, we construct identities that are externally approved but internally hollow. We become what gets applause, not what is true. In a culture addicted to validation, the shallow becomes the safest path, because to be deep is to be misunderstood, to be vulnerable is to be exposed, to be real is to be rejected. And so we adapt, away from the terrifying beauty of our own interiority. So today, we ask a difficult question. Why does modern culture reward the shallow, And more urgently, what does it cost the soul to play along? In this video, we'll go deep. Friedrich Nietzsche, for all his cynicism, had a radical insight. He who fights with monsters should look to it that he himself does not become a monster. We become shallow, not because we are stupid or lazy, but because we are afraid of meaninglessness, afraid of pain. And yet, paradoxically, it is in that very darkness where depth is born. Dostoevsky knew this. His characters, Raskolnikov, Ivan Karamazov, the underground man, are not paragons of virtue. They are shattered, haunted, and unbearably human. And if you gaze long enough into an abyss, the abyss will gaze back into you. What happens when we never gaze into the abyss? Through the lenses of Jung, Orwell, Nietzsche, Freud, Dostoevsky, we'll explore the psychological, cultural, and historical forces that made this shallowness not just common, but profitable. This is not a rant, it's a reckoning. And if you stay with me, we might just find the first thread in the slow, painful excavation of the self. So why does the shallow thrive? That leads us back to something real, something enduring, something worth being. To understand why the shallow thrives in our modern world, we must first understand the mental architecture that allows it to take root. Something terrifying, This isn't just a societal flaw. It is a reflection of the human psyche itself. Let's begin with a simple but haunting observation. Most people are terrified of themselves, not their public self, but the raw, unedited self, full of contradictions, unresolved wounds, and silent longings. And he believed that much of human suffering comes from our refusal to confront this shadow directly. The man who feels deeply learns to laugh loudly. He was terrified of a world where language itself was weaponized, stripped of nuance, reduced to slogans, and used to control how people think, instinctively to long words and exhausted idioms. The shallowness Orwell feared was systemic, not just cultural, but existential. The great enemy of clear language is insincerity, Orwell wrote. In fact, history is full of warnings. The woman who carries ancient sorrow learns to smile effortlessly. The child who asks profound questions learns to keep them to themselves. We learn to perform, become images of ourselves. And, like Narcissus, we begin to fall in love, not with who we are, but with our own reflection. Sigmund Freud saw this impulse too. He believed the ego constantly negotiates between the demands of the ID, our raw, primal instincts, and the superego, the internalized voice of societal judgment. What happens when society rewards only what is surfacely well? The ego becomes trapped. It learns to suppress complexity in favor of consistency. And in doing so, it loses contact with the unconscious, the wellspring of creativity, meaning, and vitality. When we avoid the darkness at all costs, afraid that if we dig too deep, we'll find nothing at all. But it is in their torment that we find truth, because the soul does not grow on Instagram. It grows in silence, in doubt, because it is easier to scroll than to feel. It's easier to consume than to question, easier to be liked than to be known, because the cost is enormous. When we outsource our identity to cultural trends, we become spiritually anorexic, full of content, but starving for meaning. We forget how to sit with ourselves. We forget how to listen inward. We forget that beneath the surface there is something vast, but also something sacred. To understand the shallowness of today, we must remember this is not the first time humanity has confronted the emptiness of its own creation. When George Orwell wrote 1984, he wasn't simply concerned about government surveillance. When there is a gap between one's real and one's declared aims, one turns. In a society of constant manipulation, truth is no longer destroyed, it is diluted. But this cultural flattening didn't begin with the internet. In ancient Rome, during its decline, bread and circuses were offered to distract the masses, keep them fed, keep them entertained, and they won't question the rot at the heart of empire. Human beings were reduced to function, to utility, to role. And in the 20th century, with the rise of consumerism, depth became inefficient. Fast forward to the Industrial Revolution. With mass production came mass identity. People became cogs in machines. Factory schedules replaced natural rhythms. As Erich Fromm wrote in The Sane Society, man has transformed himself into a commodity. He experiences his life forces as an investment, which must bring him the maximum profit obtainable. Considering the conditions of the market, began to brand ourselves long before Instagram made it literal. Even religion, once a source of mystery and moral depth, in many places became commercialized, repackaged into feel-good sound bites. Contemplation doesn't sell. Ambiguity doesn't advertise. Suffering doesn't convert to quarterly profits. Suffering was no longer sacred. You are sane in an insane system. They believed in silence, in mystery, in the unseen. But modern culture is loud, despises mystery, and it worships clarity, even when that clarity is false. Carl Jung once wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." In a shallow culture, this unconscious life is ignored, dismissed, or worse, demonized, but it doesn't go away. It simply retreats underground into what Jung called the shadow, the rejected self. Everything we suppress in order to be accepted by society, our anger, our grief, our insecurity, our creative chaos, all of it is buried there. And so, a tension forms within us. We've inherited a culture that's fast but hollow, wide but paper thin, loud but emotionally mute. So, when you feel disconnected, you now live in what philosopher Byung-Chul Han calls a transparent society, where everything must be seen, shared, liked, tracked. Nothing is allowed to remain hidden. Even the soul must be made visible, monetizable. When nothing is private, nothing is sacred. The consequence, but inside, something rides, something protests, something knows that the self we've constructed is not whole. It was inconvenient. In contrast, Ancient traditions, from Buddhism to early Christianity to the Stoics of Greece, all held suffering as central to wisdom. And the more we deny the shadow, the more it controls us from the dark. This is why people sabotage their relationships, why they feel anxious in moments of peace, why they chase pleasure but feel emptier every time. The shadow cannot be escaped. It can only be integrated. In his novel Notes from Underground, Dostoevsky captures this perfectly. The unnamed narrator, bitter, isolated, defiant, is not a hero. Jung described this process as individuation, the lifelong journey of unifying all aspects of the self, both light and dark, into a coherent whole. Nietzsche once wrote, "You must have chaos within you to give birth to a dancing star." But we are taught to fear the chaos, to avoid it, to edit it out. And so, the shallow thrives. They believed in going inward. We've lost the ability to sit with contradiction, with ambiguity. In myths, across cultures, from the Greek catabasis to Christ's descent into the tomb, this pattern repeats. Then, the emergence of new life. But today, we skip the descent with the sacred discomfort of not knowing. I am a sick man. I am a spiteful man. And yet, he is more alive in his suffering than the people who numbed themselves into civility. Why? Because he confronts the truth of himself. He is not optimized, he is not productive, but he is honest. That is the first act of rebellion in a shallow world, when life feels like a performance. When your deepest thoughts seem unwelcome in everyday conversation, it's not just you. You are deep in a world that fears depth, and yet, here you are, listening. Which means the story isn't over. Not yet. There is a war inside every human being, and most people are losing it, not because they're weak, but because they've never been taught that the battlefield exists, split. On the outside, we are agreeable, pleasant, marketable. We post filtered pictures, say the right things, meet expectations. That our success is a lie we've bought with the coin of self-abandonment. But modern culture doesn't support individuation. It supports conformity. It prefers predictable roles to authentic lives. T.S. Real. His monologue is a revolt against the rational, orderly society that leaves no room for contradiction. To tell the truth about your pain. But this truth-telling demands courage. It means facing the parts of yourself you've buried. The anger you were told was impolite. The sexuality you were taught to fear. The despair you medicated away. It also means facing the paradox that you are both capable of great beauty and great cruelty, both noble and flawed, both divine and broken. Because shadow work is not efficient. It is not glamorous. It does not promise quick results or easy peace. It is, in fact, a descent. Death before rebirth. You lose the false self before you find the real one. First, the descent into darkness. We want the resurrection without the crucifixion, the crown without the cross, the light without the shadow. And so, we remain stuck, performing the same patterns, smiling through silent breakdowns, numbing ourselves with busyness, entertainment, and endless noise. But somewhere within, your shadow waits, not as an enemy, to remember that depth is not found in perfection. If Jung showed us the shadow, and Nietzsche taught us to dance with chaos, then modern life taught us something else: how to run from it all. We live in an era where distraction is not just common, it is curated. The shallowness of our time isn't a side effect. Every ping of your phone, every swipe of your feed, every recommended video is part of a system designed to keep you from sitting with yourself. Why? The real questions begin. The inner voice that has been whispering your name for years, quietly, patiently, while you were too busy watching the highlight reel of someone else's life. Modern distractions are anesthetics for the soul, and, like any anesthetic, they numb pain, but they also numb truth. As Blaise Pascal wrote, all of humanity's problems stem from man's inability to sit quietly in a room alone. But who can sit alone now? Not when there are likes to chase, reels to loop, and content to consume. In truth, you are not the user. You are the product, and your attention is the prize. In this economy, depth is inefficient. Reflection does not go viral. Long walks do not generate data. Even our pain is processed by algorithms. Feeling low, here is a 10-second dopamine hit. Feeling anxious, try retail therapy. Feeling lost, just rebrand yourself. No matter how fast you run, you cannot outrun yourself. Not forever. Psychologist Rollo May warned that modern life has replaced being with having, and now with appearing. When the dopamine wears off, when the curated identity begins to crack. And yet, it is there in the dark that the seeds of meaning begin to grow. Meaning is not found, it is made. Modern society tells us that meaning is external, that it lies in achievement, validation, followers, money, legacy. But true meaning is created in the space where you meet your shadow, make peace with your wounds, and step into your own mythic journey, owning every part of yourself, the light, the dark, the shame, the brilliance. Your breakup is not just a loss, it is the shedding of false intimacy. Your anxiety is not just a symptom, it is the scream of your unlived life. Because true depth demands time, silence, discomfort, and none of these can be monetized. To feel again, to remember, to become real. George Orwell's nightmare was not simply about oppression, it was about forgetting. Because something in you aches when life feels shallow. Something in you recoils from the empty performance. Something in you knows there is more. If you feel like there must be more to this life than hollow likes and curated smiles, you are not alone. You are not broken. You are awakening. And every awakening begins the same way, with a decision to stop running, to stop performing, to turn inward and listen. 'Cause beneath the shallow noise of the world, the depth of you is waiting. That ache, that unrest, is not a flaw. It is your compass. It is your rebellion. It is your inner call. It will keep you entertained while you quietly decay. But the soul has its own logic. It speaks in dreams. Do not ignore it. Do not smother it in content. Do not wait for permission. Start small. Sit in silence for 5 minutes. Journal without editing. Ask the hard questions. Who am I when no one is watching? What have I buried just to be accepted? What do I actually want? Not what I've been told to want. In longings, in the questions that will not leave you alone at night. And the world desperately needs people who can hear it. Not to fix the world, but to remember themselves. In a world obsessed with shallow impressions, be someone who lives with depth. Be someone who remembers that even the quietest life can hold a thunderous truth. And if this message stirred something in you, like, comment, and share this video. Not for metrics, but to signal to others that they are not alone either. To reclaim what Orwell feared we would lose. To live as if the soul still matters, because it does. Read Jung, Dostoevsky, or the mystics. Find symbols in your life, not just routines, but rituals. Not just distractions, but directions. You do not need to become someone else, because the soul does not want to be seen. It wants to be found. Okay? You only need to become yourself, the part you exiled in order to fit in. It's a culture that forgets the soul, forgets truth. And when truth disappears, the self follows. But beneath the noise of the world, beneath the filters, the notifications, the endless scroll, there is a quieter voice, a voice that does not shout. It calls softly, persistently, from the center of your being. Your emptiness is not a curse. It is a space waiting to be filled, not with content, but with consciousness. And in doing so, creating a life that is not shallow, but symbolic. To live symbolically is to see your life not just as a timeline, but as a tapestry, to see your pain as initiation, your failures as mythic trials, your longing as a sacred compass. When something inside whispers, "This is not it," that is not a breakdown. That is a beginning. Carl Jung believed that neurosis, anxiety, depression, inner turmoil is not just a sickness to be treated, but a signal that the psyche is trying to grow. You just have to be honest, willing, awake. Dostoevsky wrote, "Man is a mystery. It needs to be unraveled. And if you spend your whole life unraveling it, do not say you've wasted your time." That is the work, not perfection, not productivity, but presence. To live a life not of shallow performance, but of deep participation. A man loses everything in a divorce: his image, his routine, his sense of worth. In the ashes, he begins to write, not for fame, not for success, but because something inside finally needs to speak. In that act, he finds himself again. A woman who spent years chasing approval suddenly realizes she has never lived a single day for herself. She walks away, not in rebellion, but in reclamation. She begins to garden. She begins to pray. She begins to cry for the first time in years. This is meaning. It is not flashy. It's not on TikTok, but it is true. That the self you have built no longer fits the soul trying to emerge. The privilege of a lifetime, Jung said, is to become who you truly are. We no longer ask, "Who am I?" We ask, "How do I look?" But real transformation is not aesthetic. It is messy. It is raw. It requires stillness, the very thing our culture teaches us to avoid. He believed that within ancient stories lie the psychological blueprints of the human soul: the hero's journey, the death and rebirth, the descent into the underworld. These are not just stories. They are metaphors for what every human must undergo to live a full, conscious life. The shallow life avoids suffering. The meaningful life integrates it. He who has a why to live, wrote Nietzsche, can bear almost any how. And your why does not need to be loud, impressive, or marketable. It just needs to be yours, authentic, hard-won, real. Because in that stillness, you begin to see it. The patterns you inherited, but never questioned. The trauma you buried, but never healed. The dreams you had before you settled. And in that stillness, you realize what you were avoiding all along was not pain. It was power. Your power. The terrifying responsibility of becoming yourself. We have traded identity for image, substance for spectacle. So we hide behind distractions, behind brands, behind busyness. And the longer we hide, the more we shrink. Not physically, but spiritually. We become flatter, simpler, shallower. But the soul was not made for shallowness. It was made for oceans. And no matter how many distractions we pile on top, the ocean does not disappear. It waits, not to punish you, but to awaken you. And so, many live double lives, outwardly successful, inwardly hollow. They scroll through curated illusions, while their own souls wither from neglect. Even spirituality, once a gateway to inner truth, is often commodified, turned into meditation apps, aesthetic affirmations, and branded enlightenment. Freud once said, most people do not really want freedom, because freedom involves responsibility, and most people are frightened of responsibility. There comes a moment, quiet, often unwelcome, when the distractions stop working. But that journey is terrifying. It demands that you leave behind the shallow waters and wade into the abyss. Jung did not just study the psyche, he studied myth. Let us look at examples. Jung called this process individuation, not becoming perfect, but becoming whole. In a shallow culture, everything is reduced to function, but in a symbolic life, everything becomes meaningful. And here is the most powerful truth. You do not have to be extraordinary to live meaningfully. Why does modern culture reward the shallow? Because it fears what lies beneath. It is not asking you to be perfect. It's asking you to come home, but you have not forgotten. Not completely. So if you're tired of the noise, if you have grown allergic to the fake, are you willing to go deeper? Not for applause, not for success, but for something sacred, for something real, because a shallow culture will not save your soul. And if you have made it this far, it means your soul is stirring. Again, shadow work. That is the real rebellion. And most of all, do not just consume this. Contemplate it.